Welcome to this Baptist News Global webinar. Here's your host, Mark Wingfield.
We're grateful that you've joined us here for this. We call these conversations change-making conversations, and that's what we want this to be as well. David Gushee is one of our regular columnists at B&G and has been in the past and now in the present, and does such tremendous work for us. But his day job is not us, it's teaching a couple of places, most notably Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, but also with an international angle to that. Now, we don't have time in our hour to get into David's long bio, but if I had a physical copy of the new book, I would hold it up right here, but I have a digital copy, so I can't really hold. Oh, there it is. There it is. Thank you, David. Defending Democracy from Christian Enemies, from its Christian enemies. Yeah, and I've been reading a preview copy of the book. It's fascinating. I thought I knew what was in it, and I was partially wrong. I was partially wrong about that. So let's just get started here with we're gonna jump in the deep end here. David, most of us who would consider ourselves air quotes good American Christians were raised with the understanding that Christianity and democracy go together like peanut butter and jelly. And yet your book, you begin in here by telling us that really, it isn't that simple. It's not even easy to define democracy. So why is that?
Well, to the first point, by the way, thanks, Mark. Thanks for doing this seminar, webinar, and for being interested in the book. And thanks to all of you who are listening in. I appreciate it. I think that part of the revelation of this moment is that for a lot of people, we took democracy for granted, both what it was and that it was just always going to be there in the United States. So what it was something like a constitution that governed the country and that everybody respected, disputes being resolved by the legal system or in the political and policy-making process, elections in which everybody had a chance to vote, a free and fair election process, and in which the results of elections were respected. I say that in the book that one shorthand for democracy is, as it has evolved, is democracy is a system in which the people govern themselves by electing representatives to make laws in their name, and then having elections routinely in which those representatives can be replaced in competitive elections. But the behavior of the representatives is limited by the constitutional order that they are serving and by the laws that they themselves have made and that govern the behavior of the lawmakers and the people. Democracy should be understood as an achievement in the sense that through most of human history, people were not governed by democracies. They were governed by somebody bigger and more powerful than them telling them what the rules were going to be. Monarchies, dictatorships, oligarchies of a small group of powerful landowners, or the feudal system, dictatorships of various types. So democracy is, though there is an ancient tradition of democracy, for democracy to be the primary way that societies are organized is a relatively recent development. Really, it begins in the 18th century. Democracy is a combination both of laws, but also customs and practices and norms. And you don't really know how all of that works if you're not a political scientist. You don't really know everything that is involved with it. You just know that it's working. And for many of us who would be listening in today, we thought our democracy was stable and permanent with agreed upon rules and that everybody valued it. But now I think the revelation of the last few years is that that's not true. And you might say my book is about why that's not true. and why Christians should double down on our support for democracy.
So, yeah, you used a phrase there a moment ago that I think is key to this. You said we took some of this for granted. And that certainly is my observation of my own experience is, we've grown up in a world. I mean, we fought the war to end all wars. And then, the World War II was a battle for democracy. And everything we've done has been about, fighting for democracy.
Supposedly. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's what we've been told. That's what that's the cheerleading that's happened. Did we just misunderstand this? Have we been miseducated? What gives here?
Well, when you study the history of American democracy seriously, I mean, one thing you end up having to acknowledge is that our democracy has always been damaged by our racism. And so our democracy was established by white landowning men, significant percentage of whom owned human beings. And anybody who knows American history knows that our democracy was damaged from the beginning. But that it was also, in its own way, a breakthrough for a movement away from monarchy to the rule of the people, as Lincoln said, of the people, by the people, and for the people. The Civil War and the outcome of the Civil War became an opportunity for, as Lincoln said, for American democracy to live up to what it was, to what its principles stated that it was about. And in a sense, we're on a long historical journey to actualize the potential of democracy here. So that's one kind of conversation. It's also true that in our foreign relations, a lot of times we've said that we've been about advancing democracy when it's really been about advancing commercial interests or a kind of an imperial or semi-imperial vision. But so all of that is true. But I do argue in the book that holding all of that as true, I still have to say that in the middle of the 20th century, we knew the difference between a democratic political order and a fascist political order like in Germany, and a communist political order like in the Soviet Union and eventually in China. And we knew that democracy, of those three systems, that democracy was the one that was best for human beings and that was most in keeping with core Christian commitments. And I say in the book that I was trained by Glenn Stassen, whose father was a serious political leader, that I was trained into a pro-democratic Baptist Christian ethical vision. And he was proud to say that the Baptists made such a strong contribution to the separation of church and state, the disestablishment of religion, the development of a democracy that was that did not privilege Christianity, but in which Christians could participate along with other people on equal terms. I think all of that is up for grabs right now in a way that probably would have astonished Glenn, because some of those presuppositions have been rejected by Christians themselves.
Well, it's astonishing to us even, yes.
Right.
So we began by talking about this, heavy association of Christianity and democracy. We think the two going together, but yet the Bible itself is a book full of hierarchical metaphors and stories and histories. And we read about kings and kingdoms, and even Jesus is portrayed in terms of monarchy, King Jesus and the kingdom of God and all this stuff. So how has that reality from the Bible shaped our view of both our faith and our culture? It seems there's a lot of folks out there today who are really into, bringing in the kingdom with emphasis on king.
Well, and then, Mark, if you add to that, there was from the 4th century until recently in some places, until the 18th century in the US, there was Christian states the official marriage of church and state in the Roman Empire, and in all over Europe and everywhere the Europeans went. So we not only have biblical materials that don't show us any democracy, we also have 1,500 years of church history that gave us no democracy. So how in the world did we get to a pro-democratic posture? We learned lessons from history. We learned that the marriage of church and state, as Southern Baptists used to say, the marriage of church and state is bad for both. I remember hearing Richard Land say that.
Right.
That the marriage of church and state is bad for both. And what's better for both is a free church and a free state. We learned that that theocratic visions in which God is the ruler, always involve some group of human beings representing and speaking for God. And always those human beings happen to be us, because we're the ones who are right. We're the ones who know what God wants. The Western evolution of liberal democracy was a trial and error process that took place over several centuries, and it involved learning the lessons of hundreds of years of religious warfare, of crusades and heresy hunting and inquisitions and conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, and persecution of Jews and by the state in the name of Jesus. The biblical thing is really interesting because I try to show in this book and some other work, there are resources for democracy in the Bible. But the Bible is not read straight off as a democratic text. You have to get there through some effort. And so a kind of a naive, non-historical reading of the Bible can easily give you King Jesus wants us to claim America for him. How could we have any non-Christians or non-evangelicals be in charge because this is God's world? How could we not want Jesus written into the Constitution because Jesus is Lord? In other words, you need some ethics and theology and church history to learn lessons that take you into a pro-democratic posture. And I fear that those lessons have been gradually frittered away, and that many, many American Christians have lost contact with the lessons learned that led to Christian support for democracy in the past.
Yeah, your comment there about theocracy reminds me of a famous line from our dearly departed, beloved James Dunn, who said people who advocate for theocracies always want to be Theo.
I'd heard that line before. It's a great line. The big kind of story in the U.S. and some other countries is even though there was the disestablishment officially of religion in the U.S., Christians had cultural dominance in large parts of the country, really most of the country. And if you know anything about living in the South, even after the 1960 Supreme Court decisions, the sense that this is a Christian country run by Christian men with Christian values central and Christian vocabulary everywhere, you didn't have to go very far in the South to run into that spirit, right?
Right.
And so a story that many people are documenting these days is the fact that our country really is more pluralistic than that now, that it really is a diverse community of people who believe some Christian things and some all kinds of other things, and that people come from all over the world and are a part of the society, and that different construals of right and wrong are everywhere, and that this is part of what it is to live in 2023 America, and to accept human diversity of values and religions, to be in the political process and win some and lose some. This has become intolerable for a significant percentage of our neighbors.
So I'm coming to you this afternoon from Louisville, Kentucky, where both of us had lived in the past, and I was here 24 years ago when I left. But I remember along the way when we first were here 30 years ago, Kentucky had the rank of being the second most homogeneous population of any state in the Union. meaning it had the I think second only to like Minnesota, highest percentage of people who were living here who were born here. And it was unheard of 30 years ago to have immigrants in Kentucky. And over the past 3 decades, that's changed dramatically. I mean, you couldn't even get good Mexican food here then. I mean, it was white and black, right? But that's dramatically changed here as it has across the United States. And it seems so much of this revolution, the pushback we're getting now, to someone like me is like, it's opposition to modernity, it's opposition to change, it's opposition to just all of these things that are different than the way things used to be. I think it's part of what you're saying.
Yes, there's a nostalgia politics, partly. Trump captured it very effectively with Make America Great Again. A nostalgia politics of a lost America. That nostalgia politics can be very effective in, and has been in many countries in many eras. I call it authoritarian reactionary Christianity.
Yeah.
I like that phrase somewhat better than Christian nationalism because I think it is more descriptive of a number of different settings, and it kind of highlights some things. The word reactionary is really important here. Picture people that you know that are mainly outraged or appalled or terrified at how America is as of now. They're reactionary. And they're looking, and they have a lot of them have a label for what's gone wrong. America has gone liberal or decadent or woke.
Mm-hmm.
God has been pushed out of public life, et cetera, et cetera. And so what is the solution? We need to take America back. Now, this slogan has been there since, this language has been there since the 60s. It was the organizing rhetoric of the Christian right.
Right.
It was James Dobson and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, right? But what I think has happened in the last number of years, especially under the influence of Trump, but there's other people too, is a loss of confidence that the culture can be taken back through the strategies that were used to be relied on in the past. Missions and evangelism isn't working. Educating kids in Christian values isn't working. The political process isn't working the way people think it should. And so, increasingly people are flirting with radical ideas. Maybe we need a takeover that is more aggressive. Maybe violence is required.
Mm-hmm.
I just saw on Twitter just now, Mike Huckabee apparently is on film saying if Trump is not elected in 2024 because of his indictments, there will not be any more ballots. It'll be bullets next time. Mike Huckabee used to be a Baptist pastor.
Baptist pastor, yes.
Ran for president. It's that kind of rhetoric indicating a radicalization of people who are saying, well, okay, forget the niceties of democratic politics. Maybe we need to storm the Capitol. Maybe we need to talk about bullets. An environment of fear and intimidation and radicalization is what I'm talking about. And it's something that has happened in some, I don't know, the mainstreaming of radicalization is a lot of the story of the last decade or so.
Well, and we saw this early on in the anti-abortion movement. 30 years ago, I lived in Atlanta and was working in the Atlanta Bureau of Baptist Press then, and got sent out to cover something hardly known at the time called Operation Rescue. And that movement was predicated on this very idea that desperate times call for desperate measures, and we've got to be disobedient to the civil law to obey God's law. So we need to physically put our bodies in play and get arrested to draw attention and to block access to abortion clinics. And 30 years ago, we thought these are just crazy people, but we've seen a lot more of that now.
You remember how it went beyond that? I remember that time. First, it was civil disobedience and getting arrested, and then there were some people shooting doctors and shooting at the clinics. Part part of the definition of democracy is not that we don't have disputes, but that we resolve them nonviolently through the political process. We deeply, fundamentally disagree about things, and we submit our disagreements to the political process of voting and elections. And if we lose, we may be bitterly disappointed, but we don't get out the guns and start shooting people. And we don't rush the Capitol and start threatening to hang people. So part of the book is showing, and I'm not the only one who's doing this, but showing that there's a percentage of Christians who have moved into a kind of a holy war mindset related to the differences that they see, and are flirting with or blessing or engaging in violence. And that's part of the story of January 6th. But also you've got other people who are saying, well, we don't really have to do that. If we know how to tinker with the institutions of society, maybe we can undermine democracy from within, kind of administratively. And there are world leaders who have gotten to be pretty good at doing that, and one of them is Viktor Orban in Hungary.
Yes.
And I have a chapter on Orban because it's the administrative deconstruction of democracy by a Christian strongman. And Orban's strategy is looking very appealing to a significant community of people who share this vision of a society, of a world that has gone liberal, gone woke, that needs to be resisted, that doesn't want bloodshed, but they do want the results that they want, even if it involves tinkering with democracy so that democracy itself is gradually deconstructed.
So just to jump ahead for a moment, then we can come back to where we were, but I think one of the most compelling things about the book that makes it different than a lot of others is you've got multiple chapters on some of these other countries where autocracy is taking hold. You mentioned Hungary in there. You've got Brazil and Poland and Russia in the mix. You give us some history from Germany and Italy, France, yeah, as well. And a few weeks ago, I was talking to someone else about this modern trend of these, autocrats, and they made the comment that it's almost like they feed off each other, like a symbiotic relationship, and they're learning like artificial intelligence and adapting from each other. What works in Brazil might work here, and they've all learned from Trump too, and are emulating some of his stuff. Do you see some interconnectedness, some energy forming around that?
Yes. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see links that are public, right? The autocrat that was attractive to the Christian right in the US first was Putin. Like you have Franklin Graham talking about in 2011, 2012 about Vladimir Putin as a model leader for restoring Christian values in a society.
Yeah.
So Putin was first. More recently, it has been Viktor Orban, who is a much smoother, you might say iron fist in the velvet glove kind of autocrat. People don't generally disappear in Hungary, they just get sidelined. Administrative measures are taken, and I describe it in the chapter, to make sure that the outcome is what Orban wants. And remember when Tucker Carlson spent a week in Budapest hanging out with Viktor Orban, interviewing him every night? And then the Conservative Political Action Committee had Orban in the US and featured him as their speaker.
That's right.
Orban, I think Rod Dreher, the Christian writer, has identified him as he may still be in Budapest hanging out at the Danube Institute there. I quote Dreher, he says, what we need is an American Orban. And Trump didn't quite meet the ticket because he wasn't disciplined enough. He wasn't careful enough. He didn't know what the levers of power were enough in his first term. But if he were to somehow get a second term, he probably would do better in that sense, right? So there are connections between Putin and Orban and American Christian conservatives. And then there also was definite connections with Bolsonaro in Brazil. So it's people who are learning from each other. Rhetoric that is shared online, strategies that are discussed and described together, a certain way of telling the story. It is especially appealing in post-Christian countries or countries that are becoming post-Christian that have a resentful Christian population that don't like the changes.
So, for all of my life and before, America has been known for exporting democracy. I mean, if we want to take this gift that we've been given and help other countries have it, but it seems that's not necessarily the case anymore. But at the same time, this has all been tied up for us in our belief in American exceptionalism. America is exceptional because we've been chosen by God and we have democracy, and therefore these things all flow from that. But this seems all messed up now.
One way American exceptionalism is still functioning is an argument that goes like this. America was chosen by God to be God's special people, but America is kicking that away because of wokeness and liberalism. We need tough, strong Christian men and some women to restore us to the right path. So the exceptionalism would not be in democracy. The exceptionalism would be in God's special choice of America.
Yeah.
And so because liberalism is ruining that, as the argument goes, then we might need to push back using extraordinary means. Sorry for my coughing. I've been doing a lot of interviews. Let me get a cough drop in my throat.
Yeah, no worries. For those of you who didn't hear this at the beginning, we've had people join us. We are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website either tonight or tomorrow morning. We'll also have a news story come out about this. So if you'd like to share this with others, you'll be able to do that. I hope you're finding this to be a fascinating conversation as well. So, David, you remind us in the book that you are first and foremost an ethicist. This is your life's work, and you write from the framework of an ethicist more than a historian or other perspectives that you could. For those of us who are terrified by Trumpism and its international kin, it's easy to see this as an ethical or moral debate, but is it really? Is that just wishful thinking on our part that, we have the moral high ground on this?
I try to expose the reader to the people who believe on the other side that they have the moral high ground. I firmly believe one cannot understand the reality one is living in without understanding the argument of the other side. So let me reiterate it again. There is a significant minority of Americans, I don't know, maybe 20 to 25%, maybe more, who believe that America is morally deteriorating and that the culture has been dominated by liberal moral decadence since the 60s. And who also believe that the heights of culture, like in higher education or K through 12 as well, in the media, in entertainment, and in the permanent government bureaucracies, has bought into the liberal ideas. And that this is bad for the society and bad for young people who are being morally confused. The democracy is not successfully pushing back against these people and these ideas. Therefore, desperate times call for desperate measures.
Mm-hmm.
For the sake of the children, family values, what could be more compelling than that, right? And so this is a counter-revolution. That language is used a lot, and I use that language a lot in the book too.
Mm-hmm.
This is perceived as a counter-revolution against an immoral revolution. Also, this is important to say, many of these folks believe that our society is no longer liberal in the sense of protecting everybody's freedom to act and believe as they see fit. But they believe that the left has taken over the culture and is enforcing a liberal orthodoxy, a leftist orthodoxy on everyone. And so, because of that, they think that it's kind of a winner-take-all struggle between leftism and, you might say, traditional Christian values.
Yeah.
And some in this group are saying, if the democracy won't work, we must try other means to win this war, because that much is at stake.
Yeah, I mean, we see this regularly, and there's an article we have at B&G today about new research by PRRI that documents that something like a quarter of Americans are firmly convinced that the liberal public educators are luring children to become transgender, which is just a preposterous idea, but yet it's firmly believed. And it's just hard to imagine what people will believe these days.
Did I see that it's a governor candidate in North Carolina who is arguing for the closure of the public schools? Because the public schools supposedly incubating all of these bad ideas for our children. So there's a lot of conspiracy thinking. Everybody who studies this sees the conspiracy thinking that is a part of this. There's a loss of contact with reality in some significant ways. There's also a heightening up of cosmic dualism, good versus evil. The QAnon conspiracy thinking really helps to make this clear. It isn't just that we disagree with Hillary Clinton, it's that she's running some kind of child trafficking ring out of a pizza joint in DC, right?
Right.
And that's, some people would believe that. It's extraordinary. So this is a period of moral panic on a certain percentage of our conservative brethren out there. My book is about how this moral panic is threatening democracy itself. And while I've written about the substance of these various issues, in this book, I'm writing to defend democracy itself. Will it survive this period of panic? And I'm genuinely worried about it. And it also explains Trump's appeal. He was seen as the Viktor Orban figure, the Putin figure, the guy who will stand strongly against the liberals and say, hell no, no more.
Yep.
And there are still people very much seeking that from him or by a successor.
So you and I had a conversation a few months ago where you said something to the effect of the things that you're having to address as an ethicist today, and this book is evidence of that, I think, are different than the things you were trained to write about and speak about as an ethicist. And the same thing is true in journalism. I never imagined there would come a day where the New York Times, the Washington Post, and media outlets all over the country in a news story would have to insert a comment to say, he said this, but there's no evidence that this is true,
right?
Which is just an everyday occurrence now in this. It seems like we really are living in a different world. I mean, you and I are close to the same age, and this is totally different than even when we were not educated for a time such as this.
I like to tell people that in Christian social ethics, as I was trained, we dealt with the political arena a lot, but the idea was democracy was presupposed. We would weigh in on specific policy matters, like what should the lawmakers write the laws to be related to labor unions or environmental regulations or abortion law or something. And the legislators would get in their rooms and they would hash it out, and there would be votes, and that would be the law, and then there would be legal challenges, and those would be judged by the judges, and then that would be respected, and then you do it again, right? The idea that democracy itself might be set aside for some kind of authoritarianism, Christian authoritarianism or otherwise, this was not considered. This was something that was understood to have been resolved by World War II and the Cold War. We were for democracy. They were for fascism and tyranny and totalitarianism. But when you see the appetite that a lot of people have for Christian authoritarianism, and then you pay attention to a broader landscape, you see that appeal is found all over the historically Christian world. There have been authoritarian Christian regimes all over Europe and all over Latin America, in some parts of Africa, and some other places. That appeal, doesn't go away. How about the laws against LGBTQ people in Uganda right now?
Right.
So it's also, it's interesting. We were also said a little bit later, the idea was it was in the historically Muslim part of the world that you might get a kind of a religious tyrannical authoritarianism. That's what it's like in Iran.
Right.
Maybe. Right. And then we were told to be worried about Sharia law and that kind of thing. But the threat of a kind of a religious tyranny, authoritarianism, you might say, is also visible in historically Christian lands, including the United States.
So let me ask one question. I'm going to do a quick question that I think is relevant to the book, and then we'll take some questions. I want to come back with a final question after that.
Sure.
You talk in the book about the difference between Christian nationism and Christian nationalism. Would you distinguish those two things for us? We hear about Christian nationalism all the time these days.
Yeah. There's a literature that began around 2018, 2019 with sociological studies. The most significant one was the first one, I think, Taking America Back for God by Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead.
Right.
And they were the ones who brought Christian nationalism to the center of the conversation, to name the tendencies that we're kind of broadly talking about today. And I was just actually talking to Andrew Whitehead yesterday about this. And basically, the thumbnail definition is the belief that America should be a certain kind of Christian nation, in which a certain vision of Christianity prevails in the public square. And then they would fill in the content, a nation that is patriarchal, that is dominated and led by white people, that is either officially or culturally overwhelmingly Christian, that has not accepted homosexuality and now transgender, that holds to traditional moral values, etc. So Christian nationism, they actually even, that language is kind of suggested just a little bit in the original book. So there's a percentage of the population, and we all know folks like this, that's the America that they want. And they're not happy to live in an America that isn't that.
Right.
The term that was used that has become thumbnail for that is Christian nationalism. I'm a little uneasy with that because there's an older discussion of nationalism in ethics. Nationalism is a kind of patriotism on hyperdrive. You might say, a nationalist is somebody who is overzealously patriotic. An uber nationalist or a hyper nationalist is so overzealously patriotic that they don't value any other nation, and they're willing to kill for their nation almost indiscriminately. Hitler's movement was described as hyper nationalist. You see how that understanding of that word nationalism is not the same thing as the kind of Christian nationism that I think is the heart of the discussion that has been introduced by Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry and Philip Gorski and people like that.
Thank you. And as you've noted, this is not a new phenomenon. It's throughout history. I'm actually teaching through the Gospel of John on Sunday mornings at church, and this past Sunday we were dealing with the latter part of John chapter 11, after Jesus has raised Lazarus from the grave, which really sets off the religious authorities who are embracing their own form of Jewish nationalism or nationism under Roman rule. It's not great, but they like what they've got and they don't want to lose it, right? And Jesus is threatening the whole apple cart with revolution. So you can find this very thing in scripture as well as in history.
Yeah.
Okay.
I hope that's helpful. It's a little complicated in the weeds just a little bit, but nationalism I usually associate with militarism and an aggressive posture on war type matters, willingness to kill. That's not exactly the same thing as the Christian nationism that I think can be distinguished.
Right. And I think you say more about this in the book that's helpful. So if you're interested in that thread, go read that part of the book. Read the whole book, but you can find that there too. Okay, some questions that have come in. First, what do we do about those Christians who don't recognize the departure from basic democracy, who don't see that what they're advocating is not democracy?
That's a great question. Because, I mean, the reason the question comes up is because that's partly what's happening. Like, take extreme gerrymandering of congressional districts, right? It's happening through the democratic process, but the outcome is fundamentally undemocratic. So gerrymandering is a threat to democracy. Extreme gerrymandering is a threat to democracy. People need the ability to assess the claims of politicians of their party or the other party with critical thinking ability, basic critical thinking skills. But one of the things I try to do in the book is I make long lists of characteristics of a healthy democracy and of threats to democracy. We need a grid. We need a plumb line. This is in keeping with democracy and this isn't. Example, threats against political opponents to imprison or harm them, fundamentally undemocratic. Even if those threats are not acted upon, they threaten democracy itself. Threats against journalists, fundamentally a warning sign about democracy.
Right. So
that ought to be obvious, but people need to be reminded of it because most people don't think about this stuff every day.
True. So a question that's come in back on the issue of Christian nationalism. Are seminaries now teaching Christian nationalism is the question.
I think some of them are, yeah. And it's funny, in the hyperbolic environment, especially of social media, the spread of the language of Christian nationalism as a critique has been met by some people embracing it and saying, I proudly wear the label. I'm a Christian nationalist. If you're against it, I'm for it.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, Exhibit
right.
Yeah.
But yes, the explicit teaching of some version of Christian nationalism or Christian nationism, or what I call authoritarian, reactionary Christian politics, it is being taught in homeschool curriculum, in K through 12 curriculum, in colleges and seminaries on a certain end of the spectrum. Yeah.
Okay, here's a fantastic question that's come in. Who is writing the definitive refutation of David Barton and the other historical deconstructionists, reconstructionists? That's a big question.
The import of that question is that part of what's going on here is how you narrate the history of the founding of America, how you describe the role of Christians and non-Christians in shaping the democracy. Because if you tell the story like Barton does, then the founders wanted some kind of godly Christian republic, and that was the vision. But all kinds of historians of early America, I mean, all the mainstream historians of early America and of the founding of the country, they all refute that. They all say that, yes, Christian influences and Christian voices were involved, but so were deists and secularists and Jews and atheists and agnostics, Catholics, Protestants. The reason we ended up where we ended up in 1789 was because of you might say, the competing and conflicting visions of all kinds of different voices. the one reason I think it has lasted as long as it has is because it has worked well. The American disestablishment regime was not hostile to religion the way that the French Revolution was. There was plenty of support for free exercise of religion, but there was not support for official state religion and the suppression of alternative views. That was decided in 1789. So anybody who's doing this godly Christian republic thing to make sense of 1776 or 1789 is writing mythology. But it doesn't take like one specialist. All the people who write about early American democracy all know that.
So here's a related question that came in while you were talking. I just want to tie these together. How about the Zionism being pushed as an equivalent to Christian nationism and spurred on by evangelical dispensationalism?
You know, there's a chapter in the book, Mark, that focuses on Israel. People haven't been asking me much about that, but modern Israel. And I basically say that something really interesting has happened there. The birth of the modern state of Israel was led by secular Jews. But a religious Zionist vision, especially here's ultra-religious, ultra-nationalist, ultra-Zionist, has been growing in Israel in the last generation. And the main community that has supported that growth is a certain kind of conservative American Protestant Zionist, Christian Zionist. It's a complicated area, but they are, in both cases, impatient with the limits on a religious state vision imposed by a more secular or more liberal, more democratic vision. I think this threatens democracy in Israel even today, just as it threatens democracy here.
Right, and we've seen a long time conflagration of those ideas, particularly here in American evangelical Christianity. Particularly through religious broadcasting, very strong influence.
I mean, the idea of a mythologizing of the nation, God's special chosen people, as soon as you do that, then what happens in the country ends up being more cosmic, biblical, and less everyday and mundane. And that's problematic in terms of having normal, healthy politics.
So I'm going to adapt one question here and twist it just a little bit. One of the themes we see is this, Russell Moore has been quoted ad infinitum now about that section in his new book where he tells the story of pastors who stand up and preach like the sermon on, literally read the Sermon on the Mount, and people in the congregation say, well, you can't, that's too woke. Where'd you get that? It's that doesn't work anymore. And we see this tremendous disconnect between the witness of Jesus and the way of Jesus, the ethic of Jesus, and what seems to be, politically, theologically desirable today. And those of us who studied the Bible extensively, taught it all our lives, we're left stunned that someone would not see that this is what Jesus was about.
I'll call on Glenn Stasson's name again. He said 30 years ago that he was concerned about the handling of Jesus on both the liberal and conservative side of the church divide. He was concerned that the Jesus that was preached on the mainline side was too thin, too vapid, kind of platitudes, but that on the conservative side, the only Jesus that seemed to be preached was Jesus who died on the cross for our sins. The Jesus who proclaimed the kingdom of God, who sided with the marginalized, who talked about justice, that Jesus, in a sense, was absent from both sides, but he was especially concerned about the evangelical side. But it has been very striking in the last few years. Jesus is a great inconvenience to a certain kind of authoritarian, reactionary, militant Christian. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy. we're not at that moment right now. This is a time for war. Jesus is not convenient. You have interesting things that happen on social media where somebody will just post a teaching of Jesus and somebody else will say, wimp.
Right.
Jesus is inconvenient to Christians who want a different agenda, and that should terrify us. And that does remind me of some of the worst moments in Christian history. If Jesus gets in the way of us doing what we think we want to do, then maybe we ought to reconsider what we want to do.
You should put that on a plaque. That's good. Okay. Last question as we're approaching the end of the hour here, and I'm wrapping several questions sort of up in one big bundle here. There's a lot of us in different walks of life who are Christians who need some hope right now. And I will say, reading your book, there are snippets of hope there, but it's not, it's not a sugar-coated pill that's just going to solve all the problems. It identifies as more than it prescribes, I think, although there is some prescription toward the end. Some of us just need to know, do you see any hope at all?
Yes, I do. The fact that our democracy held under extreme pressure from November 2020 to January 2021 gives me hope. The most powerful officer in the land was actively attempting to undermine the results of a democratic election, and he failed. The fact that the courts have consistently sided with the rule of law, and that now a bunch of people are indicted or in jail for what happened after 2020 November is a sign of hope. I talk in the book about all the extremist candidates who went up for major offices in the fall of 2022 and lost. That gives hope, right? The young people who know in their bones that this crazy politics of the right wing, maybe of their parents and grandparents, has nothing to do with Jesus. There's not a lot of young people are attracted to this. They know there's something wrong here, and they're moving in resistance to it. Gives hope. We also, the depth and history of our democracy and the civil society organizations that are committed to democratic norms, they don't go away easily. They're not going to go down without a fight. So if you compare our situation with Russia, Russia never had a democracy. There was the Tsarist regime, then there was communism, and then it never really gave birth to something new. We have 240-year head start over that, right? So the US situation and all these other things that I named do give hope. But I do think we need to explicitly retrieve the best resources of Christian ethics to make a case to defend democracy again. And we need to contest every election in which democracy is at stake. And I think 2024 is another one.
Yeah. Would you hold up the book again so everyone can see the cover? There you go. Fantastic resource. I know a lot of you are looking for resources and just any help you can find to have conversations with people in your family and your churches. This is a good book for that. It's a great resource. Highly recommend it. Of course, keep reading David's work at B&G as well. There's a lot of wisdom there. David, thank you for your time. Thank you for your graciousness. Thank you for your commitment to telling the truth along the way, and even when it's inconvenient to do so. We want to thank everyone. Go ahead.
I appreciate it, Mark. Can I just say that the book has study questions and could be used in a small group, and it comes out on October 3rd. And so, I hope that it will be widely used. I think there'll be a lot of people in our constituency that will find it helpful and hopeful. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us. And if you want to come back and watch this video or share it with someone later this evening or in the morning, we'll have it up and a story about it as well tomorrow. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Support independent faith-based journalism. Baptist News Global.